Okay, so we're going to continue looking at CSS3. And last time we looked at the basic kinds of selectors. So we have an element selector, which is just an HTML element. Sometimes we speak loosely and we refer to the HTML elements as tags, but strictly speaking, element is a better name. So in this case, the first rule, son of a bitch. In this case, the first rule set will apply to every anchor element in any of the documents affected by this style sheet. And then we saw that we could create class selectors. Mainly we did this with the paragraphs. So we have norm text and story text and poem text, which are all different kinds of text, and they're all on the paragraph tag. We saw generic selectors where we don't specify the element. Those begin with a dot, and those can apply to different kinds of elements. Those are usually real general things like left or right. Occasionally you'll have one for the text formatting. Then we looked at ID selectors. These begin with a pound sign, and they have to have a matching ID attribute in the document. And each ID has to be unique to each document. Okay, so I can have the same ID in multiple documents, but in any given document, the ID can only occur one time. It has to be unique. Then we saw the context or descendant selectors, where we have a rule that applies to an element with it when it's within another. And in this case, this is an element rule, but this could be an ID. So I could have an ID here and a space, and then the sub-element, the child element that I want to apply to. Then we saw that we can use attribute selectors in this fashion, and that's not something we do very often. Now we're going to look at some more selectors, and frankly, these are pretty obscure. These are all new to CSS3. I don't routinely use them myself, but they're real powerful and you can do all kinds of things with them. And you want to at least be familiar with them so you can kind of, oh, okay, that's a selector, and then you can look it up, figure out what it is. So the first one is the direct parent selector. And if you look here, we have a header element, and then we have an A element. And so this would only apply to A elements that are direct children of header. And so in this example I have here, it does not apply because the A element is not a direct child of header. It's actually a child of nav, which is a child of header. Do you see that? So this is an example where it would not apply. It would apply, for instance, if I said header greater than symbol nav, then it would apply to the nav, okay? And this is kind of subtle, so it turns out that the other one that we used before, it will anywhere within that, okay? So for instance, if I go back here, if I have this kind of selector and I have nav space A, that will apply to the A. I'm sorry, if I have header space A. So the A is not immediately in the header, it's in the nav. But this is a descendant selector, so it'll apply to anything if it's anywhere within the outer container. I feel like I struggled a little bit there. Did you get the difference? So this one will work for this element's anywhere within this, even if it's subnested. This only works if it's a direct child. It's got to be an immediate child. Okay, so it can't be within something else that's within the header, which is what we have here, and that's why this doesn't work in this case. Okay, sorry about that. The sibling selector is kind of interesting. So this allows you to select elements that directly follow a sibling. So again, we talked about how we're using this computer science structure called a tree, which represents a hierarchical structure. In computer science, trees are always upside down. The root is at the top. And so as you go down, the elements off of each node are called children. And when you have two children of the same element, they're siblings. They're like brother or sister, okay? So it's really common to use this sort of genealogy, human relationship terminology to describe these trees. So basically what happens here is this would apply to a nav and an H1 element if they were at the same level. That is to say, if they're the child of the same element. Now, this is not a very good example because that's not too likely, actually, right? Because really what we would expect is that the H1 would be within the nav, and then it wouldn't be a sibling, it would be a child, okay? So that's not really a great example. Whoops. Let's see, make sure I didn't go too far here, sorry. Okay, we have these pseudo-selectors, first and last child, and these are useful for things like lists. So here, list item colon first child, really it'll select the first list item in the list. And you can see how that would be useful to apply style to it, right? Now there's another way of doing this, but it's not as direct, and that is to put a span around that and then apply style to the span, okay? So you can always apply style to an arbitrary bit of markup by using a span. But this is a real specific way to do this, and it would do it consistently. So basically, and also I wouldn't have to mark up the HTML. To do the span, I'd have to insert the span tags in the HTML. This I can do right from the CSS. So first and last child. Now, that doesn't have to be a list. That could be any other structure that has child elements. It's just common to use this on lists, okay? Similarly, we have first letter and first line, and these pseudo-selectors use a double colon. This is introduced in CSS3, which is the latest version. So this allows me to apply style to the first letter of a paragraph or the first line of a paragraph. Right off, I'm not sure if it'd be meaningful to use the first letter and first line in other contexts. It might. I might be able to do this on a heading, an H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, but I'm not sure. So again, this is commonly going to be used on a paragraph. Now, the before and after selectors are, these are kind of intense. You can actually insert content into the page using these. And so if you look here, this P double colon before, then you have a text thing content, and what I'm not clear about is how I would do like HTML here. So I'm not sure if I could use this to insert an image before each paragraph. But what this will do is it'll actually insert this text, read this, space, dash, and then it'll have a background color of yellow and a color of red, and it'll be bold. So that actually is going to insert that before every paragraph in the document. So if you think about that, that's a real powerful editing tool that now I can actually change the, actually insert content with the style sheet. And then similarly to before, we have after. So this would do the same thing, but it would insert it after each paragraph. Okay? These examples are from the W3 Schools tutorials. You should be looking at those. That's a very good entryway to get into this technology. So those don't always go all the way down to the bottom and cover every little detail. But a lot of this stuff you don't use every little thing. So it's a really kind of nice balance. And where it doesn't go deep enough, I'll do that in class. So I just wanted to mention that that's like a primary source of information. You'll often see that that does give you more information than the readings from the textbook do. So you want to be doing those, okay? Here's some more attribute selectors. These rapidly get very confusing and they're very specialized. So we saw already that I can just select an element when it has a specific attribute. I can also select an element when that attribute has a specific value. That's the second one here. And then this is called the contains operator. This is actually an operator from the Perl programming language. So this says as long as the attribute contains this value, but it might have something else. Okay. Let's see. I think this one was invented just because of a style that's used commonly in jQuery. So this selects elements that have an attribute that starts with the value and then is followed by hyphenated values. So you might have already noticed when we were playing with jQuery Mobile, it had like data-role. This is a selector that would let me access those, okay? Then the next two are the begin and end. And so basically the second one here on the page, this constructor looks for an attribute where the value starts with this, the value starts with this, okay? And this one is the opposite, it ends. That point symbol and the $ are part of something you're going to learn later on called regular expressions. Anybody seen these before? One of the things I always tell my students is you want to know regular expressions. So there's a few types of technologies that I kind of talk about as being part of your toolkit. Regular expressions are really good to know. They're very powerful. You can use them directly in most editors. So for instance, in Dreamweaver, I can use regular expressions to do select and replace. So it's really great when I'm editing a document to be able to say, find all the lines in the document that begin with a string, and that's what that up arrow symbol does. Or find all the documents, the lines that end with something, which is what the $ does. Later on in the course, we'll look at the regular expressions a little bit because we can use them in web forms to validate the entry that the user puts in. So for instance, patterns. What the regular expressions do is they express patterns of sequences of letters. So for instance, if I told you 3 digits, then 2 digits, then 4 digits, what would that be? It would probably be better if I wrote it out on the board here because you're not, the visual thing, you'll recognize it instantly. But when I say it like that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's watch this. What is this going to be? What is that? That's a social security number, right? So it's really powerful for me to be able to write a little mini language that says, is this a social security number or not, when I have that field in my web form. That'll instantly tell me if the user entered a correct sequence of digits that can be a valid social security number. And I can put the dashes in there if I want. We kind of intuitively know these patterns, and that's the way the regular expressions work. So we'll get into those later on when we look at the web forms. The reason I'm mentioning them now is these are the same symbols that the regular expressions use. So that little pico up arrow is the beginning of the line, and the $ string represents the end of the line. Okay? Let's see. This does an absolute search. So what will happen is it'll do a substring match where it ignores whether or not the value is a whole word. So the idea here is that I could have a class like this. So some value, I'm just going to say class. It doesn't have to be class though. All right, and then here's my attribute, and it could have something like this: relation, description, valid, okay? And so if I'm testing this, With the star operator, it basically will look for a substring match. So the other ones are going to look for a complete word or an absolute match where it matches the whole field. So if I use the $equal here and I'm looking for val, it'll find it because VAL is there. Okay, you see how that works? So it's a substring match, but it doesn't have to be a whole word. Okay? All right, here's the quick summary of these. You can look at this. Again, this is pretty specific, and you probably won't use it for anything I'm going to ask you to do. Okay, but it's good to know that it's there if you need to. Okay, we've talked about this before. Block attributes all have padding, margin, and border. They don't have to have it, but they support it. And you can style all of these. Here's a quick review of our CSS box model. We talked about this previously. So the content, which is typically text, although it could be an image with the image tag. Then we have an area immediately around the content, which is the padding. And that's going to be between the border and the content. And then the margin is between the border and the adjacent elements in the page. Okay? And the shorthand of this is that you almost always want to put padding on block elements so they don't butt up against other things. And when you have a border around something, you want to put padding so that the border is not butted up against the content. Okay? We'll see that today when we start working here in Dreamweaver. We looked at display, and there's actually a bunch more options now for display. But the ones that we're concerned about are block, which changes an inline element to a block element, and inline, which can do the reverse. You might want to know why we use display none. Can you imagine why we might use that? What is that going to do? That'll actually blank the content out. So for instance, if I've set up a section of my page to automatically get ads from Google, when I write a print screen with a media query that's going to allow the user to print the page out, I might be kind and set that to be none so that they don't have to print the ads out, that they can just print the information on that page. How many people actually do that? Not too many. But that's a nice thing to do, okay? Similarly, you might have stuff like maybe you have like a logo on a page. You're guessing the user doesn't need the logo, they just want the information on the page. You might be kind and set the display to none in the print style sheet, okay? Now later on when you learn JavaScript, and I'm hoping that you'll go on in software development and learn the JavaScript and really get into this web development, we can use the display equals none to programmatically display or not display elements. So then I can have conditional logic. So I might have something, if you tell me you're a grad student, I got a section I want you to fill out. Otherwise, I don't want it to show up if you're not a grad student, stuff like that. Okay? All right, let's see. Okay, so did we talk about borders yet? Did I do a border in here with you this week? Didn't we put border around our header on Tuesday? Nobody remembers?
Tuesday was last week, but I think we did it last week.
Okay, so maybe last week. All right. So border style is the way the border is drawn. And there's a bunch of options. I hardly ever use these. I usually just go with solid. But take a look at them, especially if you're a designer. You can probably appreciate this a lot better than me. But these are the different border styles. So dotted, dash, solid, double, groove, bridge, inset, outset. Again, Dreamweaver will have a drop down for that, so you don't have to remember those. But the one I typically use is the solid. Occasionally I'll use a double, okay? And then we set the width of the border, which is really the width of the line that's drawing the border. And notice this is very small, 0.5 EM, that's half a character. That's going to actually be a pretty decent border, okay? There's a different way of doing this that uses CSS selectors, so you can see that in Dreamweaver in the drop down. That's fine to use that too. This is one place where some people will use the PT or PX values, which are absolute. Again, it's probably better to just get in the habit of not using those unless you're writing a style for printing, which then I would use the points, so like 12-point font, for instance. But occasionally people will use pixels here. The problem with this is pixels are not the same on every machine now, okay? So that's why it's better to use the relative measurements like the EM. Okay, we did talk about margins. So border works the same way as margin. You have basically, when I say border width, that's going to put the same width on all four sides of the border. If I want to change that, I can go ahead and expand the selector, and then it becomes border dash top dash and left, right, and bottom. Okay, so top, bottom, left, and right, same as margins. Okay. All right, the border radius. This is really cool. We can now make borders, instead of having square corners, they have rounded corners. And you know, I think that we might be missing some information here, because if memory serves, that's one of the things that doesn't quite work the same in each browser, and we have to use these things called browser prefixes. So border radius is the default attribute name. But because the browsers haven't all converged on this, I think you have to use the prefix. And so what happens is we end up writing the rule like 3 or 4 times so that one of those will work, okay? And the convention is to use this one, which is what the standard should converge to, as the last, okay? Did you guys read about this already in your readings or anything? No? Okay, well, so basically, I think this is dash moz dash, then border dash radius. So in each case, it'll be this with the prefix. Okay, does that make sense? And then the one for Oprah is O. Let's see, what do we have? O, Mozilla. I can't remember the one for Chrome. What the hell is that? Oh, WebKit, right, so dash WebKit. So again, what happens is I write the same rule 4 times with the prefixes. And so WebKit, Opera, Mozilla, and then just the plain rule at the bottom. Oh yeah, I think there's one for IE in there too. It's either IE or MS. I'll bring that back into you. Really, I should expand the slides here to include that now. Okay, we looked at background color already. I talked about this last time too, where you can use an image. You can control if it repeats or not as the background of the, instead of a color, I'm using an image for the background of the page. Here's a little bit more information about doing the positioning. So basically, I can use percents on the horizontal and vertical, or I can use these keywords. So left, center, or right on the horizontal, top, middle, or bottom on the vertical. And then you can see how the percents correspond to that. So bottom on the vertical is equal to 100% on the vertical axis. So you can use these to, and you use these when you're not repeating the image, right? So I'm going to have one image. I might want it in the center. I might want it in the upper left. All right. A lot of times we'll want part of the page not to scroll. So if I have a page that doesn't quite fit on the screen and I have a navigation bar at the top, I want that to stay at the top and scroll the rest of the page so the navigation is always available. So I can do that with the fixed keyword. So I'll specify that the background is fixed and then it won't move. Here I'm using fixed on the background. You can use that on other content as well. Okay. All right. Here's how we do the positioning. Really, I kind of talked about that already. And then you can actually change the size here, and again, it's best to use percentages here too. So if I have an image that I'm using for a background, especially if I'm not repeating it, it might be pretty big. And basically, I want it to size the same way when I'm looking at a smaller, form factor. And so I'll use the percentages to do that. If I don't do that, what will happen is it'll just show as much of the background as it can, and it'll look kind of crazy then, right? All right, this is pretty straightforward. Okay, I'm going to come back to the positioning and layout, so I'm going to break off here.